Good morning, everybody. It is my great privilege to introduce two of Britain's finest historians. They actually, there we are, we're off to a good start. They need little introduction to the Cliveden audience, but we're going to have a small one anyway. William Dalrymple, historian of the British and the Mughals, podcaster extraordinaire of Empire, won too many prizes to mention. We'd just be here all morning, and now
you should say that the podcast doubled its numbers after Sebag came onto it. So
okay, there we are. And his new book is The Golden Road: How Ancient India Transformed the World, about the influence of Indian culture on the world, a reassertion of the subcontinent as a superpower. And Simon Sebag, Montefiore, historian of Jerusalem, Stalin, Romanovs, and the world, which also recounts how Indian religion, art, and science influenced the globe, all the way from Roman England to Indonesia and China. Now, these two have known each other a very long time.
We certainly have.
40 years.
Agreeing to disagree for 40 years.
Yeah. We're still just here.
I don't know if anyone's noticed, we won't get into it particularly, but sometimes they even discuss world affairs on Twitter.
Never.
But wonderfully, for all of us, they're still on glorious speaking terms.
Well, let's see how we'd go today.
Okay. So we are here to discuss the Golden Road meets the world, and then we're going to travel many centuries to where two great dynasties, the Mughals and the Romanovs. So our plan is to spend sort of the first half on the ancient world and the second on modern India and Russia. This is quite ambitious, so if we don't reach modern times, forgive me, it'll just be because these two know too much. At least they can do much about it.
We're very loquacious.
Yeah,
so,
I know, that's what worries me. But
warning.
Okay, so William.
We cut it off on her.
So William, your new book introduces many to an idea once perhaps well known to ancient historians, but which has sort of got lost in the mists of time to general readers. But please tell us, how did Indian culture influence the world? And what is the Golden Road?
So this is a book about how India provided foundational ideas which have influenced the way we all operate every day. Most obviously for people in this room, in this part of the world, the numbers we use every day, the numerals that we have, not the Roman numerals MCVVXV1, but the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that we use every day, which we call Arabic numerals because we got them from the Arabs, but actually are invented in India. And it's a very interesting thing just to put out to the audience now. We're all brought up with learning about Pythagoras and Archimedes. Probably by our 5th or 6th birthday, we know that story of Archimedes and his bath. But how many people in this room have ever heard the names Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta? Put your hands up. Oh, Indian heritage. Oh. Everyone who's not of Indian heritage.
Okay,
three out of a highly educated room of, what are we? How many in this room, Sebag?
500.
500.
Yeah.
So Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, between them, defined zero, so providing the numerals we use every day. You'd have thought this is something that should be on every school textbook. It's the nearest thing the human race has to a universal language. And yet, they're completely unknown in our syllabus to this day. Why is that? That's one of the questions that the book asks.
Can I just ask you something on that? How do you invent, I don't want to sound like a maths dunce here, but how do you invent zero? How did you arrive at that?
So it's a very interesting question, and we've got his writings, but we haven't got a sort of autobiographical spiel about how he came to it. But
yes.
What mathematicians and philosophers speculate is that the idea of the void is at the heart of Buddha's thought. And that by focusing on the void, Indian thinkers before Brahmagupta came up with the idea of an absence between positive and negative numbers. But Brahmagupta's contribution was to realize that zero, which is such an obvious idea for all of us now, once you stumble on it, But his contribution was to realize that 0 is a number with qualities like other numbers. So he defines it in 10 rules, one of which is it's what you get when you subtract a number from itself. So you give 0 a number. And once you've got 0, you can then do 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. And as amazed Europeans who discovered it as late as the 12th century, as Fibonacci, who brings it to Europe, says, it means that you can express any number with the 9 Indian symbols and 0. This is completely different. So Fibonacci was brought up in Algeria. And he was an expat kid. Like my kids went to the local school, like my kids learned Arabic. I mean, my kids learned Hindi. And so when he came back to Pisa in 1120 and discovered that everyone was still trying to do multiplication with Roman numerals, MCVVXV1 times VVX1, he thought, these guys need a bit of help. So he wrote the Liber Abaci, and this is the book which launched. And then there's a very nice walk-in role for a Scotsman in this, which I'm pleased to say. It's always. I had to try harder with this book than with most.
Always put a Scotsman in there.
But the nice Scots moment to this is that Fibonacci produces his first book on the Liber Abaci. And it goes out locally, and people regard him as a genius, but it doesn't spread around the world. Until the great Stupor Mundi, Frederick II, turns up in Pisa with a cavalcade. He arrives with giraffes and elephants and tigers and his whole menagerie.
And a harem.
And a harem.
And a harem.
Not to be forgotten.
And an Arab bodyguard.
And an Arab bodyguard. A whole troop of Arab archers. Yeah. And he challenges Fibonacci to a sort of like countdown. It's a public sort of mathematician, but of course Fibonacci, being Fibonacci, wipes the floor with all the others. And then he's introduced to Michael Scott, who any of you here brought up in the Borders will know from Sir Walter Scott as Michael Scott, the wizard who cleft the Eildon Hills in 3, which he wasn't actually a magician, he was just a mathematician, a brilliant mathematician. And he says to Fibonacci, this is all very well, all this highfalutin theory you've produced, but you need to make it practical. So the second edition of the Liber Abaci has money conversion, weights and measures, double accounting, interest rates, and all the things which then go on to produce the Italian banking revolution a generation later, the Medici and so on. And we'll go right to the end of the book first, but this is what Piero della Francesca reads. And what Kenneth Clark calls the greatest small picture in the world, the flagellation, is Piero della Francesca's meditations on perspective in the light of his 3 mathematical treatises that he writes before painting it. So it all links into the Renaissance and the rise of Europe. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's wonderful stuff, and we might come back to the money, actually, but I want to ask Sebag something. In the Golden Road, William credits you with coining this marvellous word, Indosphere.
Yeah.
Was there no real word for that yet, and how was the Indosphere spread?
Well, I don't know if I really invented the Indosphere, but I came up with it. I don't know if it's ever been used before or not. But William very kindly says that he's got it from my book.
I definitely got it from you.
And the thing was when I was writing The World, the whole point was to write a vision of the world, not just from the viewpoint of Western Europe and the Atlantic, but to write a history of the world that actually included places that people didn't normally learn about or know about, from Cambodia to Haiti to Hawaii to Albania. And of course, India is one of the huge parts of the world that are underknown in sort of Western history teaching, and hence the rise of William Dalrymple. but I would say that it's interesting. I mean, William, you in your interviews you sometimes say, like, why does everyone know? There's often this question asked, and in your podcast too, it's like, why do we not know? Why is this not taught in our syllabuses in British education? Of course, this is one of the big questions. But the fact is, it's not always a conspiracy for or against empire or the West or anything. It's often just the fact that virtually nothing is taught in our education system, and there's very little time for anything. So you often ask, we may discuss this, but this is one of the interesting things raised by your wonderful book, by the way, which is wonderful, delicious, and filled with your usual mix of learning and anecdotage. But what I would say is that the reason why this Indosphere is less known and less taught in our schools is really because of the common. We've been much more interested in the Arab world recently, since 9/11, and the Arab world has been kind of widely taught, and people know much more about the great era of the Abbasids and Baghdad and all of that, and all of their scientists, and the word algorithm comes from one of those great mathematician philosophers. As you probably all of you know.
Our Persian friends will be very upset if you call him an Arab, though. Al-Khwarizmi is claimed by the Persians, definitely.
Of course, but it was ruled as a single block. It was the Arabic Abbasid, and first the Umayyad Empire, then the Abbasid Empire, and there was a huge fusion between Arabic and Persianate culture, language, poetry, and everything. So most people now, and I think if I asked you if you'd heard about the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, for example, and I asked everyone to put up their hand. How many people have heard of that? Baghdad, for example. Yeah, quite a few more have heard about that.
Well,
but not many. No. But I think that's,
there's still work to be done.
Yes, there is. But I think that's one reason why the Indosphere is little known. And I think the other reason, which is also, I'm sort of saying this to sort of in praise of the Golden Road, is that it is a golden road. It isn't an empire. It wasn't the worst states, the Guptas and so on.
Who were land empires.
Were land empires. But they never ruled all of India. But the point is there were multiple states. And this was really the work of mathematicians, adventurers, travelers, who spread this Indian culture, Indian faiths around on travels, businessmen, merchants. And they went, they traveled from Vietnam and Indonesia all the way to Afghanistan. And as some of these Buddhist priests made it to the court of Harun al-Rashid, which I hope we'll discuss.
Well, on this, Willie, you told me last night there are other reasons why this isn't known about the way India had told its own story to itself, maybe.
I should perhaps say, so mathematics is the last third of the book. The first 2/3 are the spread of Buddhism, which, of course, the Buddha is an Indian holy man, born just over the Nepalese border. His enlightenment takes place in what's now Bihar. And his first sermon is in what's now Uttar Pradesh, outside Varanasi in Sarnath. And so the first part is about Buddhism spreading. And with it comes Indic languages like Sanskrit and Prakrit, a whole cosmology, philosophy. And it's like a sort of, in a sense, a Trojan horse containing within it a whole range of other ideas about the world, such as karma and reincarnation and cycles of time seen as a circular thing.
And the wheel of life.
And these things spread out so that, just to put it out there, over half the world's population today lives in countries that are now or once were profoundly altered by Indian religions and philosophies. And yet we are not aware of this, that this this incredibly wide-ranging knowledge is something that barely figures in our consciousness.
So for both, how does something that starts in India end up, conquering China and having such a...
So that's a figure that both Sebag and I have written about, Wu Zetian.
Yeah, Wu Zetian, Wu Zetian is one of the most fascinating female rulers of all time. Travelers from China in the beginning, this is the Tang dynasty in the 7th century. At the beginning of the Tang dynasty, in 629, a Chinese traveler went traveling around the whole of India. And he said something like, the one thing I discover when I travel, as I travel, is that in all parts of the world, in all places, everyone admires India and Indian culture. That's a sort of near quote, slightly ill-remembered. But the point was that he then went back to China, and he started... the Emperor of China was the second Tang emperor, Taizong, amazing character. who was one of these kind of extraordinary people who we could do with now, really, who could sort of read books, write. He could write a tract on Buddhism. He could write poetry, but he could also ride a horse, lead a cavalry charge.
And rather impressively, is put partly on the throne by Shaolin Kung Fu monks.
Yes, yes. Yeah, but he didn't need that much help from them. He basically just hacked his way. But the point was that he loved horses so much. He lived horses, he wrote poetry about horses, and he had these beautiful horses designed for his tomb. But the point was that he was really the person who kind of fostered the beginning of Buddhism, promotion of Buddhism alongside Taoism into China. And of course, what we forget now, and William chronicles this, as I do in the world, is that it became the effective state religion. I mean, there was a lot of syncretism.
Have an Indian religion become the state religion of China.
Of China and Japan. Yeah. And Japan. And so it's a fascinating, so the great empire of Tang, which expands into Central Asia, it conquers Korea, it goes south into Vietnam, and out of this dynasty, the Tang dynasty, arises this extraordinary woman who
starts off as a 15-year-old fifth-ranking concubine.
Starts as a fifth-ranking, but she comes from a good family. So when one says concubine, it doesn't mean it's not a byword for sort of prostitute, as we sometimes use it these days. It was a court rank that you worked your way up. The fascinating thing is she was originally a concubine for the grandfather, the old emperor Taizong, who had an affair with her. Then she was spotted by the son, and there was a real question of the problem of like if the concubine had slept with the father and the son, but they got over that. Then they married.
It's a good story to tell. She gets put into a monastery nunnery with the other wives and the other concubines, as was the custom. And because she managed somehow to snare the son just before she goes in, a year later he comes to visit to pay some ceremony for his father's memory, and she manages to get a very passionate love poem to him. Yes. And she's given away all her silks and is now in stark Hessian robes. She's got shaven head.
Even, but she's still incredibly beautiful.
And she's helped by the intervention of the Empress, who's very worried about another concubine who sees the Gaizong's bed and taken him over. So she helps get this woman against all taboo out of the nunnery into the new emperor's.
Big mistake. Big mistake.
According to a local historian of the time, she had loosed a tiger on the mountain.
Yes. But like I say, she was a very impressive woman, because again, you have these amazing characters who can do tough stuff and also kind of literary, sensitive stuff. So she could write a beautiful love poem, and actually her love poems are actually, even in English translation, are extremely exquisite.
When you strip away my pomegranate dress,
yes,
you find the beating heart of redness.
There it is. But at the same time, she'd impressed the old emperor, who was obsessed with horses. She famously went to him and said, like, he was trying to train a horse, and she went up and she said, I could break that horse for you. And the emperor said, how? Because this little woman who's a girl, who's a teenage girl, and she said, I need three things: an iron whip, a hammer, and a dagger. And we said, how? And she said, I'll either break it with the iron whip. If I fail with that, I'll just hit it on the head with the hammer. And if I fail with that, I'll just cut its throat. And she walked off. Well, believe me, she got promoted to concubine. She got promoted. And anyway, as empress, she's presided over an extraordinary empire, and she really proves the idea. One of the themes of all of our books is sort of we want to now cover female leaders, and there's a wide belief that you hear all the time on Radio 4 that if only female rulers were ruling the world, if only those kind of Scandinavian prime ministers were running, there'll be no wars and everyone. Well,
Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, Mrs. Thatcher,
Catherine the Great. Anyway, but Empress Wu really disproves it, because she's an absolutely brutal character who, among many, many other things, murders her own children, murders other people's babies, murders umpteen whole families to the last person, and is incredibly, but also builds beautiful Buddhist. She has a Buddhist statue of herself. She has a Buddhist.
She has herself carved onto the face of the Vairocana Buddha, the universal Buddha at Longmen, which is about 1,000 feet tall.
She creates a giant sort of Buddhist palace. She rebuilds the wild goose pagoda.
But the important thing for my story is that she comes to sole power, having first of all become empress. Then her husband has a mysterious series of strokes, and she takes charge from behind the curtain. And then, when he dies, she becomes the only woman in 3,000 years of Chinese dynastic history to seize power, not as Dowager Empress, not as Empress Consort, but as emperor herself. And this directly goes against all the very patriarchal teachings of Confucianism. So how does she get around that? She brings in Indian Buddhist monks from the University of Nalanda and their Chinese-trained counterparts. So you have this bizarre thing that's effectively an Indian Buddhist coup d'etat at the heart of the Chinese court. Only lasts one generation.
Can I just, just tell you one story, which is a mixture of Buddhism and pure perversion? Because I think we're being far too high-minded here.
This is heading exactly in the right direction.
Empress Wu is, of course, among many other things, an enthusiastic lover and has a series of favourites, all of whom end bad and end up being kind of having to be executed or beaten to death or castrated or whatever when they cross her. She's not a generous person to be in love with like Catherine the Great. And this leads to one of the most bizarre corruption trials in all of world history, when the Zhang brothers, who are her favourites, she's made them all dukes. They're absolute nobodies, but they claim to be Buddhist experts on Buddhism, and they actually write Buddhist tracts trying to get in with her, which you will know more about.
Yeah, there's this whole, I mean, it's very comic. She basically wants all the Buddhists to find references in Buddhist scripture that predict her golden age. So all these sort of, ambitious Indians turn up making up sutras that don't exist, or faking sutras that do exist, and adding things to the Lotus Sutra. And there is, in the Lotus Sutra, a mention of a Devi who will rule with iron rods, which is the reference which is picked up from that story.
They also write that she's going to grow, her teeth will grow back and her hair will grow back, because she's already in her 80s, you see. And so when she reads that, they get promoted to Duke immediately. But just to cut the quick, because we could spend a whole hour on the Empress. Sorry, Catherine. I've got to just finish this. So when in a court intrigue, these 23-year-old dukes, as they are now, the Zhang brothers, are accused.
Wear heavy makeup.
Who wear heavy makeup and dress up in it's all incredibly camp and bizarre, but sinister too. They all, and you've got this 80-year-old woman they're telling her your teeth are about to grow back. I can see the roots beginning. And so there's a court intrigue. They're all arrested and they're put on trial for corruption, but she's backing them. And the way they get off is that they testify that they have fed their sperm to the Empress to help her grow her teeth back, grow her hair back, and regain youth. And after this extraordinary, this should be, you missed this. Now this is the most extraordinary defense for corruption in the whole of world history. And this defense, it actually works, and they are found innocent. I
can't see Keir Starmer using this for his free tickets.
Yes, yeah. Well, I was thinking that too. I think the Labour Party today should keep far away from the Zhang brothers as precedents for their defence.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Well, it's a lot for 10 a.m. But
I know it's a bit early for that. I know it's a bit early for this sort of stuff.
No, it feels it's got a 5 o'clock vibe now. But we're,
This is one of the things about Clifton. It's the only time of year that I ever end up getting bored of champagne, because you start at breakfast. By tea time you want something different.
Okay, well, what can I say? William, moving on, the Silk Road has become a sort of historical industry all of its own. But in your book, the ideas of the East sort of reach the West mainly by sea. And to mix metaphors, is the Silk Road a paper tiger?
Yes. So first of all, I should say that a lot of the ideas in this book came in discussion with the person who I was last on stage with here at the previous dinner, Peter Frankopan, who's a brilliant scholar and whose book,
our dear friend and comrade.
He hardly mentions Indian trade in that, and this book is written slightly not as a demolition job at all, because I love the book very much, but as a counterbalance to what seems to me an overly Sino-centric view of early trade. So the Silk Road is an important thing to talk about. I'd always presumed it was an ancient phrase that Marco Polo uses. Bullshit. It's invented in 1880 by a German geographer called von Richthofen, who's building a colonial railway to Beijing. Marco Polo doesn't mention it, Xuanzang doesn't mention it, it's not there. It first reaches Britain in 1936 with a Nazi-sympathizing Swedish explorer called Sven Hedin. And it becomes popular, just as Sebag and I are at college, and I often do in Xanadu. And it was an idea that's by the 80s had become a buzzword. It's a very romantic idea, camels passing over the Pamirs and the sand dunes. And it's certainly a big deal in the Mongol period, when the Mongols shove a motorway through the middle of Europe, destroying everything that had been there before. And Marco Polo does indeed travel on a single passport from the Mediterranean to the China Sea with great speed. But you often see maps of the Silk Road that give the Roman names for the cities on the Mediterranean. So it's Antioch, and the impression is given that this is, Antioch is the terminus in the west, and the impression is given that this was something that is eternal, that was always there, and was specifically big in classical period. The actual reality is that the Chinese and the Romans had only the haziest notions of each other's existence. But in contrast, India is the biggest trading partner of the Roman Empire, so much so that Pliny talks about it being the drain of all the precious metals in the world. Strabo goes to a port called Myos Hormuz on the Red Sea, which is, if you like, the Roman border with India, because it's a sea border. Once Antony and Cleopatra have committed suicide, and Octavia Caesar has taken over Egypt, India and Rome are neighbors. And Strabo says in the 1st century AD that from this one small harbor, which was not the biggest port was elsewhere, Berenike, but from Myos Hormuz, he says, a fleet of 250 vessels every year leaves for India. And we have the kind of lonely planet of the period called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which has detailed knowledge of every single port, down to weird things almost as bad as the Zhang brothers. For example, the fact that the king of Gujarat has a taste for Roman singing boys and castrati. And so you have 30 different ports named, the things you can buy, the things you can sell, the proclivities of the rulers. So there is, again, this completely forgotten world whereby Rome and India are not only trading partners, but are the biggest trading partners. And not a single Roman coin Roman coin hoard has ever been found in China, and yet there are tens of thousands of them all over the Indian coast, and there's big sites being excavated at the moment in Kerala, Muziris, where, the Roman amphora, Roman this, Roman that, and we even have examples of Romanoi, as they're called in the inscriptions, converting to Buddhism and dedicating, Romans dedicating pillars and gifting objects to early Buddhist temples. So, again, there's a sense in which I think the Silk Road has not only been projected forward or backwards 1,000 years to the Roman period, but it gives the whole trading patterns of that part of the world a sinocentric bias, which has been taken up by Xi Jinping and weaponized with his Belt and Road. And as far as the early classical period, it's frankly bullshit. It's totally unhistorical.
It's not a road.
Yeah, it's not a road.
It's a sea.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the main thesis of my book, The Golden Road, that's a reference to the fact that there's this sea road. One of India's great natural gifts is the monsoon winds that center on the Tibetan plateau. Every winter, it freezes over and cold winds rake in. Every summer or spring, it thaws and winds blow out, which means that if you're an Indian sailor at any period in history, you simply have to put up a sail. And for 3 months a year, you have these rapid winds blowing you in the direction of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, so that you can get there in 2 months, from Kerala to Egypt. And then, very helpfully, the winds reverse, And you can come back equally quickly. You have to wait for a bit in between. So people go there, they sit around, they go and visit the pyramids, and then they come back. But
can I just say,
just to complete this thought. Then, in the 5th century, after 400 years of this, when everyone, India has become incredibly rich from all this gold is pouring in, Rome goes down, and the Indians are in a fix because they've been used to just gold pouring into their boundaries. And almost the last thing that makes it out of India are the red Rajasthani garnets in King Redwald's purse in the Sutton treasure. That's the last big sort of package of Indian goodies to arrive just before this whole trade route goes down for 300 or 400 years. And then the Indians have to find an alternative, so they pivot eastwards. And this is the period when Indian sailors begin first to trade with, then advise, and then culturally subsume great chunks of Southeast Asia, which is why, in the end, the largest Hindu temple in the world is built not in India, but at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which is a Vishnu temple. Why the most sophisticated Buddhist monument in the world is not in India, but in Borobudur in Java.
But as you've so beautifully explained, this is a takeover by sailors and merchants, not warriors.
Correct. And previous one of the reasons that it's not known, we talked about how it's a complicated reason why it's not known, and partly due to general ignorance, but one of the reasons it's not known is that previous generations of nationalist Indian historians wrote books saying these are Indian Hindu colonies in Southeast Asia, which is not true. They were not martial colonies founded by Indian kings. And there's still a lingering idea, which you get reflected in the latest Indian parliament with a map of what is called Akhund Bharat, which is Greater India, which shows what looks like a political kingdom that stretches down to Java, and which the current regime is very keen on this idea.
But that's nonsense, isn't it? That's
as a
absolute
political
nonsense.
idea, it's nonsense. But as you and I both write, as a cultural expression, the Indosphere is a real thing. But it is a cultural expression. It's absolutely not a political
it's not an
So
conquest.
empire.
are we talking zeitgeist rather than empire?
Yes, I mean, the thing is, well, I think the thing is that, and also you have to remember what's happening in the rest of the world. Again, another reason is this is exactly the moment that a new religion is bursting upon the world, and driving both west and east. And of course, this is Islam. And so again, another reason in history, I mean, in historiography, one reason that this hasn't been written about enough is because people are generally more excited by kind of empires galloping across, conquering
We
things.
both love a good battle.
We love a good battle, rather than rather scholarly Chinese monks visiting monasteries.
With backpacks full of scrolls.
With backpacks full of scrolls and all of that sort of thing. So in fact, this is the time when between us and there is the creation of the great Arab Empire, the spread of Islam all the way from Spain to the borders of India.
Yes, one of the highlights of the world is the rule of the Barmakid family in Baghdad,
Yes.
who did so much
Again, one of our mutual
also to spread
friends.
the idea of zero.
Well, they start off in bulk in Afghanistan as the high priest, which William writes about in the Golden Road, and the Barmakids are just a fascinating family. They start as Buddhist priests. They then become the doctors to the Umayyad caliphs in Damascus, and of course those are the people. Abdul Malik is the person who builds the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So all of these, that's the fun thing about these sort of world histories, which we're all writing now, which is that everything connects up, and it's partly these fascinating connections that are happening simultaneously. So the Barmakids start serving the Umayyads. When the Umayyads go down in 750, they switch to the rising, the black flags of the Abbasid revolution.
One of the young Barmakids has been at school in Rasafa, which is near where the ISIS headquarters was, at the back of Syria.
Appropriately, because this revolution has some kind of resemblances. They have the black flags, and they take over the empire, and they promote Khalid al-Barmak as the chief minister, and his son Yahya becomes the famous chief minister of Harun al-Rashid, the 1001 Nights, really one of the most exciting, decadent periods of world history.
Whose son enters you will all be familiar with without being realized it, because his son is Jafar in the Disney Aladdin.
That's right.
far more
And there are
present
many.
in our lives.
That's very true. Jafar is a key character. He's in the 1001 Nights. He's in the Aladdin, and he becomes the best friend of Harun al-Rashid, the sort of greatest of all the Abbasid caliphs, who's also in correspondence with Charlemagne. Sends him an elephant. Sends him an elephant. So all these worlds connect up. And
for my purpose, what's interesting about them is that, as Sebag says, they were Buddhists before Islam. They very pragmatically convert and rise to the top. And the reason they rise to the top is that in the Abbasid revolution, they are keeping the accounts of the army, and they're using Indian numbers.
Yeah.
And Indian accounting is brought in. And as a result of the way that he brilliantly manages the accounts, he then is told to go and create a new city. And it's this family of former Buddhists who are Sanskrit literate, who have trained in mathematics in Kashmir, who found Baghdad. And they bring in, the first thing they do in 776 is they bring in a delegation from Sind containing the work of those two mathematicians which we talked about at the beginning, Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And a compilation of these books, which the Arabs know as the Great Sind Hind, is translated by Al-Khwarizmi in Baghdad. And his title for the book that he writes, translating this, is the book of calculation by the Hindu method, by calculating and balancing. And this is too much of a mouthful for people, so it's just known, as it spreads around the Arab world, as Al-Jabr, which is the basis of our world, algebra, while his name, Al-Khwarizmi, the man from Khwarazm, Khwarazm is northern Uzbekistan. Those of you who've been on one of those lovely Silk Road trips to Uzbekistan will have visited Khiva. Khiva is the capital of Khwarazm. So Al-Khwarizmi becomes our word algorithm. So this is all the heart of our present culture, but we don't know where it's from.
Okay.
I should just say that, God, this rainstorm is dramatic.
I hope everybody can hear.
This is amazing. Can you all hear from what we've...
We've got our own monsoon, but...
Yes, the monsoon has arrived. But I just wanted to say, the Barmakid family, who are this amazing family, who are patrons of all the poets, and it is a great period when singing, rather like we pay for sort of rich football clubs bid for star footballers today, in Harun al-Rashid's Baghdad, singing girls were the football stars, who became very rich, built their own estates, and they were bid for by powerful potentates.
And when the Barmakids are done away,
yes,
their estates are given to Zubaydah,
yes,
who's the greatest of them all.
Yes, exactly, the great princess.
Yeah.
No, that's it. That's the end of the Barmakids.
Okay.
Boom.
Barmakid's gone.
They're gibbeted. It's rather like a night, like the kind of Godfather moment.
Exactly like that.
Different posses are sent out to arrest different members of the family. They're killed, gibbeted, and hung on the gates of Baghdad.
Yeah.
Can I ask you both, just to slightly change a craft question? Willie, I want to ask you how you wrote this book, the process of your research and how it differed from your previous books.
Well, it involved a much longer holiday to go and stay in Amman resorts and Angkor Wat and so on. No, it was a lovely process. It was just, I did the reading during, Sebag and I both got locked up with our libraries during COVID, and the result of his lockdown was the world.
That's right.
And the result of
I
my
went
lockdown
to
was
Angkor as well. I went to some of the same places.
Yeah.
Okay.
At different times, of course.
Yeah.
We couldn't meet. We couldn't travel together.
We have taken long walks in Colorado and Boulder and India.
And India, yeah.
Okay.
But we've never actually been to an airport together, as far as I know.
No, and that could be dangerous.
Look, I'm very conscious we haven't actually got to the Middle Ages and the Mongols, so let's just have a couple of random sort of questions on that. Sebag, what was the attitude of Genghis and successors to religion, and the Mongols and their successor Tamerlane? invaded Russia. So can we bring Russia
Well,
in
this
a
is
little
just
bit
okay.
just for the last 5
Okay,
minutes?
well, that's a very
Yes.
good. Well, that's a very
Yes.
good way of linking these two. We can live.
Yes.
We can sort of link these things. So and the Mongols. We mentioned the Mongols. Who conquered this sort of the world's biggest empire from. They failed to take Japan, but they made it all the way to Hungary and Poland. And they established an empire in which there was a Silk Road where you could travel with one passport from Karakorum pretty much to Crimea or something like that. Anyway, that empire rose and it fell. And then in the Central Asia, Tamerlane, Timur the Lane, an incredibly able warlord, tried to recreate a Muslim version of the Mongol Empire. He was born in 1330, died in 1405, about to invade China, which he failed to do, but he sacked Delhi, he sacked Damascus, and he was a fascinating character who introduced chess to the world or popularized it.
An Indian game.
An Indian
How
game.
does he come to rule India?
So
He doesn't, but
he conquers
family,
it, then withdraws.
Yeah, his family.
And according to some, it's scholars differ on
Yes,
this, but according
okay.
to some etymologies, the Hindu Kush it means the tears of the Hindus who he kidnapped from Delhi and brought back to Central Asia to build Samarkand. But the point for my book is, and it's a very nice place to end the story here, because previously Indian merchants have been free to travel both overland and by the sea. The Mongol Empire Mongols do not ever take the whole of India. Until that many centuries later, the Mughals do, which is a different story. And there is a hostile border above the Punjab, from which Indians are cut off. So the old merchant routes that used to be able to just set off northwards into the mountains and arrive in Central Asia, that's no longer possible. Plus, equally important, the Mongols have massacred and attacked all the great cities of Afghanistan, like Balkh, you mentioned.
Khiva, Merv.
And the Persian-speaking elites are scattered. Some, like Rumi, go to Konya in Turkey. Many others come down to Delhi. So Delhi, which had previously been a slightly rough sort of Islamic frontier town, a wild west, without much civilization or learning, in the early Islamic period, suddenly fills with Persian scholars of the highest caliber. And this is the period that North India, pivots from the Sanskrit-speaking world of the Indosphere to becoming part of the Persianate world, where Persian texts and Persian learning get a new layer of sediment, if you like, above the Indic layer. So one of the reasons that India is so complicated, but also so rich, is you've got 3 successive layers of sediment. You've got this whole complicated, multifarious Indic layer, which has Prakrit and Sanskrit, Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist. Then you get another layer, which is the Persianate layer, which is the works of Ferdowsi and Hafez, all of which become very popular in India. And Persian, between the 12th and the 19th century, becomes the diplomatic language of Persian courts, even in Hindu courts in the south. And then in the 19th century, you get the British layer, and everyone has to pivot again and suddenly learn Shakespeare and Jane Austen and all the rest of it, and become what Veers Naipaul called the mimic men, subsuming their own culture to British culture.
Why did that happen? Why did the Mughals decline and the British get their grip?
I've written 4 books on that.
Yes, I know. Well, yes.
It's a challenge to put it in a sentence.
A little bit.
Save us
In
reading
1
them.
minute, before the questions.
They were conquered.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can look at this in different ways, in the sense that the Hindu nationalist government in India will talk about 1,000 years of slavery. First Islamic, then British, and so Modi will sandwich it together as a single, and it's not a completely illegitimate idea. But it also, in my view, certainly gives India its richness. You've got the Sanskrit world with all that pertains to the richness of that great language. You then have the whole Islamic layer that produces the Taj Mahal and the Mughal miniature and all the incredible refinement of the Mughal court. And finally, you get British and English, which means that we had Salman Rushdie on this stage yesterday. Salman, brought up in Bombay, is one of the greatest masters of the English language alive. And just like previous generations of Indians mastered Persian, and for example, the poet Bedil, buried in Delhi, is the most favorite poet of Central Asia. So Salman is our hero here today, who's shown complete mastery and conquest of the English language. And to me, that's a great richness and an advantage that India has. It has this tricultural sort of layering. But as I say, others don't necessarily share that view.
Okay, well, this is all amazing stuff, and I encourage everyone to buy these marvellous books, because I feel like we're only having a little sort of taster here of what's within them. Now it's time to have some questions, if everybody or anybody would like to. This gentleman here, have we got some microphones? Yes.
I feel we haven't given enough Romanovs.
I might take two at once, actually, if we could do this gentleman here and this one over here. You go first. Go on.
You touched on British rule in India. How much would you say of our perception of Indian culture and ancient India is influenced by the sort of romanticism of many British officials in India in the sort of early 19th century or late 18th century?
Actually, let's just go for it. Go on.
Sure.
Yeah.
So there's many different British attitudes to India, and I argue in my books that there's two important moments. There's the early period when there is an enormous interest in Indian culture and learning, and people like Sir William Jones discover that the Mahabharata is in many ways a cousin of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there's huge admiration for Indian culture in the 18th century. But as Indians move from being equals talking to East India Company officials to being subjects of the Queen under British rule, Indian culture goes down in the eyes of the British, who regard it as, by the mid-19th century, in the era of Macaulay, famously writes that a single shelf of a good English library is worth more than the whole of the native literature of India and Arabia. So you get a much more, we would call racist, much more Eurocentric, much more Anglophilic sort of attitude to Indian culture, and India is downgraded. And you can argue that one of the reasons that we don't know who Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta is, one of the reasons, is simply that although they're mathematicians as important to us every day, having invented the numbers we use, as Archimedes and Pythagoras, you could argue that is in somehow a distant echo of Macaulay's prejudices. But it's very important to realize that both things are there. You'll find many Brits, particularly in the 18th century India, who are completely in love with all that world. And the excitement of those early Sanskritists translating all this stuff is palpable in their letters and their admiration for this culture.
Okay, thank you. Do we have one over here?
So you said that India was the Roman Empire's biggest trading partner, and you mentioned Pliny the Elder mentioned it. But at the time of Alexander the Great, it seemed that India was a bit more murky. He was going there for unclear reasons. When did it become that? When did it become such a big trading partner?
Only with Actium. The moment that Egypt is subsumed into the Roman Empire, at the moment that the empire is beginning and the republic is ending, you suddenly get... The ports are already there. There's already Myos Holmus and Berenike. And archaeologists find a few Ptolemaic amphora and so on in these early trading sites in India, but it's one or two. Well, by the 1st and 2nd century AD, you have whole Roman lairs. And not only that, but you've got... There's a wonderful... this is actually lovely you brought it up. There's one particular document, which is the archaeologists and economic historians are particularly excited about at the moment. It's called the Muziris Papyrus. And the Muziris Papyrus is now in Vienna, and it came from a murky antiquities dealer, and no one knows exactly where it's from. Probably Oxyrhynchus, where it has these amazing rubbish dumps where papyrus has survived. In the first day of excavation in the 19th century, Grenfell and Hunt, who were the two archaeologists who dug it, found the Gospel of St. Thomas and lost poems of Sappho in the rubbish dumps of literally day one of this. So this is one particular random survival, and it is an invoice, a shipping invoice, from an Alexandrian Greek ship owner in Alexandria, awaiting a consignment from an exporter in Kerala. And we have, in this one case, a detailed invoice for everything that's in one container, in one ship, called the Hermapolon. And what's astonished the economic historians is the colossal expense of these items. A single container containing largely ivory, but also pepper, cotton, something called nard. Do you remember in the Gospels, Christ is supposed to have had nard smeared on his feet by Martha, and all the disciples complained that it should have been sold and given to the poor because it's so expensive. So there's a consignment of this arriving from India. And they also has another column for the take of the government on arrival at the customs. So this one document shows that had this one container on Hermapolon arrived safely in Alexandria, the ship owner would have been able to buy one of the very largest estates in either in central Tuscany or in Roman Egypt, depending on his wishes, and to have had enough money to join the Senate. And working up from these figures, a scholar called Rao McCaughlin in Northern Ireland, and now echoed in the new Oxford Book of the Roman Economy by one of my All Souls colleagues, Andrew Wilson, has calculated that 1/3 of the entire Roman imperial budget came from the customs take on the Red Sea. These colossal imports of pepper, ivory, all these unnecessary luxuries that Pliny's furious about, and wondering why decadent Roman women need to wear silk when there's perfectly good wool around, this sort of stuff. Or they need to smear black powder over their food when it's just, who wants this pungent taste anyway?
Can I just come in there? Because a couple of things. Because Pliny the Elder is outraged by all these luxuries from that come via India, and says, why is it that we have to see the debilitation of women, see Roman women almost naked through these silks that arrive from India and China? And Seneca is even more outraged by this. And he says...
old fogies.
Yeah, old fogies who says, it's an absolute outrage that these silks are arriving through which the public can see more of Roman wives than their own husbands. But I also just want to go back to this Alexander the Great. I sort of slightly...
Can I finish that just before... Go back to Alexander a second. Hold on for 1 second. Just the final figure. So
hurry up.
1/3 of the entire Roman imperial budget. So Hadrian's Wall, the Rhine frontier, the Algerian fort, 1/3 of that entire budget came from this customs thing. Over to you.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, other people say 25%, which is slightly less. But anyway, the fact, I think it's one thing that you mentioned Alexander the Great, and I think that you slightly, I agree with absolutely what you say about the Romans flag. And when they say Roman merchants were trading with India, they actually meant Indians. The seamen, the merchants, were actually Indians who were trading. But it started much earlier. And I mean, when you read about the triumph of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, for example, which is at the beginning of the Ptolemaic Empire, he has Indians in the procession, and when it's this procession is really a kind of trade fair, advertising the wares that they're trading with the East. And so these are the people that founded Berenike in all these ports. So it's not a coincidence that there are already a whole lot of new ports down the Red Sea waiting to trade with India. The Ptolemies.
Berenike is named after a Ptolemaic princess.
Ptolemaic princess, Berenike, Berenice is a Greek princess's name, and she's the daughter of one of the Ptolemies. So it really starts with the heirs of Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, especially the Ptolemies in Egypt, who create the trade with India that Willie has described.
Okay, clearly a good question.
Very good
Can
question.
we have a couple more? Luke over here, and then you will go here and then here.
Thank you, Catherine, William, and Sebag, for such a fascinating and wide-ranging talk. Hey, it's me. Hello. Hello. I write about Africa, African history and culture, and I'd come across some of the sources you had, William, and really, really fascinating. Even looking at, you mentioned the winds, and actually, even the Swahili sailors who were going from India, and especially in the medieval era. But what I wanted to ask actually was not about the past, but about the future. And actually, I'd love both of your views on this. Is arguably since the maybe 15th, 16th century, we've had a lot more of an Atlantic influence on the rest of the world. I mean, in your books, you talk about, Indian, Chinese, and then I look at African influence on the rest of the world. Do you think that now we're entering a period again where we all see, again, this flow of more Eastern and Southern culture, cultural elements, political elements, diplomacy, social customs, etc., flowing back to the West and the rest of the world, in the same way that over the last 500, 600 years we've seen that flow from West to East? Because as you guys described beforehand, it was more kind of East to West, the Indian Ocean. That was sort of the center of of a lot of things, a lot of activity, a lot of trade. So, Sebag, maybe if we start with the answer.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question, Luke. I mean, by the way, Luke's just written a very good book, a history of Africa, personal history of Africa, called Motherland, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, which is coming out soon, which I happen to have read, which is superb.
Thank you.
So very recommended.
Thank you, Sebag.
Yeah.
But let me just say, we are entering a totally new era. I think what we didn't realise for the last sort of 70 years, that we were in an exceptional period of world peace that we regarded as the norm, and it's now over. And that period was really, I call it the Great Peace, but it was really divided into, the first period was a sort of Cold War between two superpowers, a game of chess, if you like. Then the fall of the Soviet Union led to a period of a sort of game of solitaire with just America as the paramount world power. And now, since around the Obama presidency, Trump presidency, we have a multiplayer computer game of world affairs. And for the first time for a long time, small powers and medium powers, like the ones in Africa, and bigger powers also, like India and Asia, and of course, obviously, it goes without saying that sort of the other superpower, China, all of these smaller powers are now following their own interests and quite happy, as India is, for example, to have its own relationships with West and East, with China and Russia, but also with the America and the West. And it's leading to fascinating things, fascinating phenomenon. One thing is the deterioration in world organizations, in supranational organizations. Another one is the challenge you're seeing all over the world on the borders of the countries that were created by colonial imperial powers and the United Nations after World War I and after World War II. In the Middle East, for example, you're seeing the disintegration of states, all the states, many of the states that were created between 1918 and 1948 are in a state of state collapse. Syria, Lebanon, Israel, all of these countries are. Libya and Sudan, and so on. And in Africa, in the Sahel, which is happening even quicker. And what we're seeing there is exsurgencies, where instead of insurgencies, exsurgencies are sort of dismantling the borders of countries that were drawn mainly by the French in that area, almost at random in the desert. So you're seeing sort of Chad, Mali, and that's what's happening with the wave of coups d'etats that are happening across North Africa, and also in Central Africa with Congo, and also in Sudan. Just last thing about this, which is interesting, you asked about the global South, as it's sometimes called, or the new powers. If you look at Sudan, where 150,000 people have been killed in the last year, and where a very, very complex civil war is taking place with terrible costs for 9 million refugees, if you look at it closely, you'll see the new world encapsulated in I wouldn't say a microcosm, because it's one of the biggest countries on earth, but it's a small example. You will see that different sides are being backed by powers that once would never have backed vassal powers with whom they're providing arms and intelligence and money. So the powers include Iran, UAE, the Emirates, Turkey, Israel, America, Russia, Saudi Arabia, all of these powers are now interfering and backing different players. So that's the new world. So these smaller powers are going to play a much greater role. Now, Africa has one or two powers that should be the giants of the 21st century. South Africa, Congo with its resources, and especially Nigeria. Ghana's rather small compared to...
we're not that far.
But Nigeria has everything. It has an educated elite. It has oil. It has size, because size is still important in world affairs. But in all these cases, the governance has to keep up with the wealth, the resources nature has given. And that's the challenge. So that's a picture of the world at the moment.
Okay. Willie, do you want to add anything to
would.
that? Yeah. Amazing.
Thank you, Sebag.
Sometimes people talk about the rise of India and China as it's something weird and surprising and out of the blue. The reality is that for 9/10 of human history, India and China have between them controlled, well, take your figure, 4/5 of the world economy. And so the weird bit of world history is what happens when Vasco da Gama arrives off Calicut. And from the 1450s till 1947, you have this weird eruption with what you call the Atlantic world, when suddenly you have the West in charge, gunboats, and all the wealth of India, the same process that had taken place under, at the time of Pliny, of Roman wealth draining into India. Indian wealth during that period drains into houses like this, and all over, National Trust houses all over Britain, 18th century Palladian villas, are built on the money drained out of India by the East India Company. And, we were born 20 years only after that. We're both 1965. 1947 is when the Indian Empire ends. We're born in the middle of decolonization, when all these African countries are, the dominoes are falling down one after the other, the Queen's going, and there's a ceremony, and a flag comes down, a new flag goes up. And the world that we are, and our children, are now experiencing is in many ways just a rebalancing of the natural equilibrium of the world's economic shape. That's what's always happened. And the only question by the end of the century is whether, as well as India and China, how far America is going to be part of that top three. America has surprised everybody. It continues to perform well and continues not to decline. And it's just, it's anyone's guess which of those three. If you asked this question 5 years ago, you'd probably say China. China's looking a bit more unsteady now. You wouldn't have guessed India as number one 5 years ago, but it's a plausible thought now.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time, but what a brilliant place to end, and we'll have to revisit. Thank you so much.